In 1990, New York set a grim record. More than 2,200 homicides in a single year. Behind those numbers was not only the sound of guns in the streets, it was a multi-billion-dollar drug economy. Heroin, cocaine, and crack flooded the city. Unknown dealers became powerful bosses, able to order death even from behind prison bars. Who was really pulling the strings? Who turned the city of bright lights into a battlefield drowned in smoke? And why, even today, does the very mention of those names still send a chill through New York? This is the story of 9 of the most dangerous drug lords in the city's history. Men who built criminal empires, leaving behind a legacy of fear. Number 9. Guy Fisher. Harlem in the late 1970s. Outside, the Apollo Theater glowed with soul and funk echoing down the streets. But just steps away from those neon signs, small packets of heroin passed hand to hand. A generation was being destroyed, and one of the men behind it was Guy Fisher, a name everyone in Harlem knew at the time. Fisher was born in poverty. He grew up in a neighborhood where police sirens were more common than school bells. He was not the reckless type flashing a knife on the corner. He was calculating, persuasive, able to earn trust. That's what caught the attention of Nicky Barnes, the man the country called Mr. Untouchable. When Barnes formed the council, 7 men who controlled New York's heroin trade, Fisher earned a seat at the table. It was not easy. To gain trust, you had to bring in money and keep your mouth shut. Fisher did both. He went further, pouring money into buying the Apollo Theater itself. Harlem watched in awe. But behind the glamour, the theater was only a shell. The clean money was little. The dirty money was plenty. Young people were collapsing on sidewalks from heroin. At the same time, Fisher sat in the front row, watching the shows. Everything collapsed when he made the mistake no one in that world could forgive. He became involved with Nicky Barnes's girlfriend. From that moment, his fate was sealed. Barnes, once the fiercest protector of the council, turned and cooperated with the FBI. His testimony tore down the organization. Guy Fisher was one of the first names targeted. In 1984, Fisher was convicted under RYCO charges and sentenced to life in prison. He walked out of the courtroom with his head held high, but from that day on, his life was only prison walls. Unlike petty street dealers, Fisher carried himself with cold composure even inside. Some inmates even called him the Professor. But outside, Harlem was falling apart. Young people hooked on heroin, families broken, countless lives lost to the poison that the council had pumped into the streets. The cruelest irony was this. Fisher wrote letters to his children urging them to stay in school and never follow his path. Yet Harlem itself was left scarred by the very choices he had made. An entire generation lost. The Apollo lights still shined, but thousands of families remained in darkness. After 36 years, Fisher was released on compassionate grounds in the year 2020. Old age and illness had consumed him. He stepped out of prison into a different world. Harlem had changed. No longer ruled by gangs, but transformed by gentrification, coffee shops, and new apartments. When people hear the name Guy Fisher today, they don't remember him as the Apollo owner. They remember a time when heroin consumed Harlem, and a man who helped fuel that fire. As people in Harlem often say, you can make money from the streets, but the streets will always take everything back, with cruelty and with tears. For Fisher, that was not a metaphor, it was reality. Number 8. Bumpy Johnson. On a summer night in July 1968, Wells Restaurant in Harlem went silent. A man collapsed at his table beside a plate of fried chicken and a steaming cup of coffee. That man was Bumpy Johnson, the figure Harlem both feared and respected. His death from a sudden heart attack lasted only seconds, but the echoes spread far beyond the restaurant. Thousands came to his funeral, some in mourning, others simply to make sure his era was over. To understand why Harlem shook that day, you have to look back at the road he walked. Born in 1905 in South Carolina, Bumpy grew up poor. His nickname came from a lump on his head he had since childhood. When one of his cousins was threatened with lynching after an incident, the family fled the South and headed to New York. In Harlem, Bumpy left school early and dived into street life, surrounded by gambling, numbers rackets, and knives. He soon caught the eye of Stephanie St. Clair, known as the Madam Queen of Harlem. During her turf war with Dutch Schultz, Bumpy became her right hand. He fought against the Italian mob without flinching. When Schultz was killed in 1935, Bumpy didn't stop. He struck a careful deal with Lucky Luciano and the Italian bosses to keep Harlem as his territory. That was his first step to becoming a true boss. In the 1950s, Bumpy was convicted of heroin trafficking and sentenced to 15 years in Alcatraz. Most prisoners broke down there, but not Bumpy. He lived like a chess player, watching, calculating. When he was released in 1963, his hair was gray, but his reputation and sharp mind were intact. 2 years later, he staged a bold move. He sat inside a police station to protest excessive surveillance. Newspapers called it the mob boss sit-in. He was arrested, but walked free at trial. Harlem saw the message clearly. Bumpy was not just another dealer. He knew how to play the system. What made him most dangerous was his ability to balance fear with community influence. He paid people's rent. He handed out food. At the same time, he stood behind shipments of heroin that devastated Harlem. He mastered the line between shadow and light, making residents both depend on him and fear him. The legend grew when Frank Lucas later claimed he had been Bumpy's right-hand man, learning everything from him. But Bumpy's wife, Mamie Hatcher, denied it. She said, "Lucas made things up to look bigger. Bumpy never treated him as his right hand." The truth is hard to know. What is clear is that Bumpy was smart enough not to need anyone to build his legend. They say he loved chess. On the board, he was patient, waiting for the right strike. In life, he was the same. That patience let him survive across decades while many other bosses were long gone. But every game has an end. The night he fell at Wells' restaurant, many felt it was the closing of an era. Yet Harlem remained with his dark legacy. Young lives stolen by heroin, families shattered by violence. Bumpy Johnson did not leave behind a beautiful legend. He left behind a cold lesson. Power in the shadows always comes with a price, and the community is the one that pays it. Number 7. Herbert Herbie Sperling, New York, in the early 1970s. The entire city was stunned when the police evidence vault was brazenly tampered with. Heroin disappeared, replaced with flour. Who had the reach to pull this off? Investigators pointed toward a name not many recognized by face, but everyone feared when mentioned. Herbert Herbie Sperling, a figure who came out of Hell's Kitchen. Born in 1938 in Manhattan, Sperling grew up in a violent, working-class neighborhood. By the age of 19, his name was already linked in court records with Joseph Valachi, the infamous Italian mobster. That was no coincidence. It was the beginning of a lifetime tied to the underworld. Unlike Harlem bosses who flaunted cars and jewelry, Herbie stayed in the shadows. He let others think he was just a man running a pizza shop on Long Island. But from 1971 to 1973, alongside Vincent Pacelli Jr., he built one of New York's most sophisticated heroin networks. Prosecutors later described him as the hub of the conspiracy. Pacelli specialized in cocaine, Herbie specialized in heroin. Together, they moved product through an elaborate system. Shipments flowed in from Marseille, remnants of the French Connection pipeline. Millions of dollars in transactions passed through warehouses and middlemen under Sperling's control. Police knew he was dangerous. Catching him in the act was another matter. In 1973, his empire collapsed. Sperling was convicted of running a continuing criminal enterprise, one of the harshest statutes of the early war on drugs. The sentence was life without parole. Instead of bowing his head, he stared at Judge Milton Pollock and said, "I am and always will be a better man than you." The courtroom fell silent. Even behind bars, his shadow remained. In 1977, Vincent Papa, believed to be behind the evidence vault scandal, was killed inside federal prison. Rumors immediately named Sperling. He was prosecuted on allegations of ordering the hit but was acquitted. Others were convicted, while Herbie walked free of that charge. For many, it reinforced the idea that he still pulled strings from the background. Behind the gangster image, there was another side. He moved his family out of Hell's Kitchen to Belmore. He ran a pizzeria and even used a truck to hand out toys to children. His son later said, "He wanted us to have a decent life, not to repeat his mistakes." But the cycle was not broken. By the 1980s, Nicky Barnes, his rival from Harlem, allegedly gave information that led to charges against Herbie's own son. In a 1994 interview with Prison Life, Sperling admitted, "I'm not innocent, but life without parole, that's nuts. What I got is a slow death sentence." He did not deny guilt, but he saw his punishment as a drawn-out execution. Herbert Sperling died in 2018 at the Federal Medical Center in Devens after more than 4 decades behind bars. From Hell's Kitchen to Alcatraz to Lewisburg, his life ran the arc from heroin kingpin to an old, sick man dying in custody. The question remains, if he had not been locked away, how much further could he have reshaped New York's drug map? Sperling never needed noise or fame. He existed as a shadow in major deals, in rumors of prison hits, and in defiant words to a federal judge. That cold, silent presence is what made him one of the most dangerous names New York ever knew. Number 6. Jose Boy George Rivera. August 1987. In South Bronx, what seemed like a small exchange was anything but. 2 ounces of heroin, 88% pure, traded for $12,000. The dealer was just 20 years old. Dressed sharp, he boasted to an undercover agent, "My organization moves about 2 kilos a week. That brings in more than $250,000. That single brag was enough to put Jose Rivera, known as Boy George, squarely on federal radar. Boy George was no corner hustler. He built an entire production line. At the center was a cutting mill, where raw heroin was diluted, packaged in glassine envelopes, and stamped with brand names that sounded like perfumes. Obsession, Sledgehammer, Delirious. Out on the streets, dozens of stores operated across South Bronx and Upper Manhattan. Workers ran shifts. Guards watched the doors. It was industrial, efficient, and silent. What made Boy George so dangerous was not gunfire in the streets. It was marketing. Branding became control. A packet stamped Obsession with a small red crown meant quality. Addicts recognized it instantly. Purity consistent. Price stable. Supply steady. That reliability destroyed the community faster than any shootout. By his early 20s, Boy George sat at the top of South Bronx. At times, he commanded more than 50 people, from lieutenants handling distribution to workers running stores to lookouts on the corners. The money poured in weekly, rivaling a middle-class family's yearly salary. He was young, reckless, and believed it would last forever. But his own words were his undoing. That careless boast to an undercover agent, that one deal, opened the door to a full investigation. Federal agents pieced together the entire picture: the Asian suppliers, the cutting mill, the street stores, the payroll. Step by step, every link came into focus. In 1991, Rivera stood trial in federal court in Manhattan. Prosecutors did not need theatrics. The numbers spoke loudly. 2 kilos of heroin a week, $250,000 in revenue, a brand recognized across South Bronx. The jury returned a guilty verdict. The sentence was life in prison with no chance of release. Inside, the name Boy George disappeared from the streets. But the damage he left behind did not. Those glassine packets of Obsession had fueled thousands of addictions, hundreds of families torn apart. That little red crown on the label for many Bronx residents was not a luxury symbol. It was a warning of futures stolen. When people remember Boy George, it is not only about fast money or youthful arrogance. It is about how a 20-year-old turned destruction into a brand, how he made an entire community his unwilling customers. One small deal exposed him, but the dark legacy of his empire still lingers in South Bronx. Number 5. Peter Pistol Pete Rollock. Bronx, Thanksgiving Day, 1997. On a playground filled with laughter, 2 members of Sex Money Murder collapsed in front of the crowd. This was not a rival gang strike. Rumors spread quickly. The order came from their own leader, Peter Pistol Pete Rollock. When a boss turns his weapon on his own men, the message is clear. No one is untouchable. Rollock was born and raised in Soundview, Bronx. He watched crack cocaine set fire to his neighborhood. He didn't just join the trade, he turned it into a system. Sex Money Murder was no street crew. It was one of the most violent sets within the Bloods Alliance. Their very name, Sex, Money, Murder, cut into the community like 3 blades. And Pistol Pete was the hand gripping the handle. What made him dangerous was not just the gun. It was his ability to command. In 1997, while already in custody, federal agents intercepted coded letters written in rap lyrics and street slang. Hidden in the rhymes was a deadly directive. The target was David Mullins, a man accused of cooperating with authorities. This was no longer a gangster in the streets. It was a boss giving lethal orders from behind prison walls, with pen and paper. To federal prosecutors, Rollock looked like a ticking bomb. He was indicted under RICO and VICAR statutes, tied to multiple homicides and conspiracy charges. Prosecutors even sought the death penalty. But in November 2000, Rollock pleaded guilty to avoid that outcome. The sentence was 105 years, no parole, under special conditions, 23 hours a day in isolation, visits tightly restricted. It was the government's way of saying, he will live, but he will live buried. Within the Bloods, sex money murder spread far beyond Bronx. The set expanded to Kingston, Buffalo, Springfield, Massachusetts, and along the East Coast. Wherever SMM operated, the whispers carried Pistol Pete's name. A phone call slipped out, a coded letter from prison. His presence still weighed heavy, even in concrete cells. Stories about him became part of street legend. One witness recalled Rollock saying, "Yo, I'm going in there and handle him," before carrying out an attack. Plain, direct. With men like him, once a decision was made, the outcome for the target was already written. That very ruthlessness turned his world against him. Some loyal members broke away. Some witnesses chose to testify. The Thanksgiving murders were the turning point. In a borough long accustomed to gunfire, people now saw a boss cannibalize his own. It fractured his reputation in ways that could never be repaired. Today, Rollock remains in federal custody. At one time he was housed in a DX Florence under special measures. He no longer walks the streets. But the shadow of sex money murder lingers. In Soundview projects, the name Pistol Pete still recalls a time when one man's power could silence an entire block. Peter Pistol Pete Rollock never needed the spotlight. He existed as a shadow, a leader who ran his empire from a cell, a man who used words instead of guns, proof that Bronx once produced bosses cold enough to pull strings from solitary confinement. Number 4. Frank Matthews, Black Caesar. On July 2, 1973, Brooklyn prepared for a trial that was supposed to mark a turning point in the war on drugs, but the defendant never walked into the courtroom. Frank Black Caesar Matthews, New York's #1 drug trafficker at the time, vanished with his girlfriend and millions of dollars. Nearly 50 years later, no one truly knows if he lived or died. Born in 1944 in Durham, North Carolina, Matthews rose from small-time gambling to building an empire in Brooklyn. Unlike many black kingpins who relied on the Italian mafia for supply, Matthews forged his own path. When denied access to the French connection, he bypassed the Italians and went straight to Cuban and Caribbean sources. The result? A pipeline of heroin and cocaine that made him the direct supplier for Harlem, Bronx, Philadelphia, and beyond. Matthews did not think small. In 1971, he called a summit of black and Latino drug bosses in Atlanta. The next year, he staged a second meeting in Las Vegas during the Alley Quarry boxing match. His goal was clear: unite minority traffickers and break free from Italian control. That boldness earned him the nickname Black Caesar, the man willing to challenge New York's oldest empire. But ambition came with violence. On Easter weekend, 1972, his crew clashed with the Philadelphia Black Mafia in Atlantic City. The result? 5 people dead, 26 wounded. 799 witnesses stayed silent. No one dared to speak against Black Caesar. He laundered money through Las Vegas casinos, paying a 15 to 18% fee to clean millions. His home was on Staten Island, in the same neighborhood as Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino family. It was said he relished the irony, a black kingpin living next door to an Italian mafia don, as if daring him without words. Then came the twist. In January 1973, Matthews was arrested at Las Vegas Airport. His bail was set at $5 million, then reduced to $325,000. Many believed his empire was finished, but months later, he disappeared before trial. Rumors claimed he took $15 to $20 million and his girlfriend, Cheryl Denise Brown. The government offered a $20,000 reward, one of the highest since the days of John Dillinger. It led nowhere. No body, no trace, no answers. Some said he fled to the Bahamas. Others whispered he was eliminated. Books called him the richest fugitive you never heard of. For the DEA, he remains one of the most wanted fugitives in American history. For communities, his name is forever tied to the heroin wave that devastated New York in the 1970s. What made Matthews dangerous was not only the kilos he moved or the millions he laundered, it was the way he cut out the mafia, opening a path for black and Latino traffickers to stand on equal ground with Italian families in the global game. And in the end, his disappearance in 1973 was the ultimate demonstration of power. A nation searched. He slipped away. Frank Matthews, the Black Caesar, The man who dared sit at the mafia's table then stood up and walked out. He never returned. Number 3. James Jimmy Henchman, Rosemond, New York in the early 2000s. The streets pulsed with rap music. MTV played endless images of luxury cars, gold chains, and young artists rising from the benches of street corners. Behind the cameras stood a man in a suit, rarely in the spotlight, James Jimmy Henchman Rosemond. To the music world, he was a hip-hop manager. To the FBI, he was something else, a drug kingpin in a suit. Rosemond was born in 1965 in Brooklyn. His childhood was shaped by migration, poverty, and constant conflict. At first, he chose music over guns. Through his company, Czar Entertainment, Jimmy managed stars like The Game, Brandy, and Sean Kingston. To many rappers, he was a bridge between million-dollar contracts and survival on the streets. But behind the studio doors, he ran another empire, a cocaine pipeline from Los Angeles to New York. According to investigators, shipments were hidden inside instrument cases, even smeared with mustard to fool drug dogs. What made Jimmy dangerous was his double life. In public, he appeared on red carpets with artists. In private, prosecutors said he operated a nationwide criminal enterprise, laundering millions through Las Vegas casinos. His crew moved product the way a band would tour. To the rap world, he was a mentor and protector. To law enforcement, he was target number 1. Then came 2007. His 14-year-old son was harassed and slapped on the street by Tony Yayo and Lowell Lodi Mac Fletcher, associates of G Unit. For Rosemond, it was more than humiliation. It was war. 2 years later, Fletcher was released from prison. Soon after, he was lured to a dark street in Bronx and fatally shot with a silenced .22. Authorities later alleged it was a revenge killing, paid for with 1 kilogram of cocaine, valued around $30,000. In 2012, Rosemond was arrested. Prosecutors described his operation as a continuing criminal enterprise, essentially a cartel. In 2013, Judge John Gleason looked at him in court and declared, "Not all kingpins deserve this, but you certainly do." Rosemond received his first life sentence, but it didn't stop there. For the Lodi Mac case, he was later convicted of murder for hire and sentenced to life plus 30 years. The empire of Czar Entertainment collapsed. The powerful manager had become one of New York's most notorious convicts. Beyond the court cases, another shadow always lingered. The 1994 Quad Studios shooting involving Tupac Shakur. Dexter Isaac, one of the gunmen, claimed Rosemond was behind it. Rosemond denied it. The LA Times once published an accusation, later retracted when it was revealed to be based on fake FBI documents. To this day, it remains unresolved. But the mere fact that his name was linked to one of hip-hop's most infamous shootings cemented his place as a symbol of the culture's darkest side. Today, Jimmy Henchman sits in USP Pollock, serving life with no release. In letters from prison he has written, "I continue to maintain my innocence, but the record stands." A bi-coastal cocaine empire, a contract killing, millions of dollars flowing through his hands. Jimmy Henchman was not only a hip-hop manager, he was proof that behind the spotlight there were shadows ready to drag an entire generation into a trap with no escape. Number 2. Kenneth Supreme McGriff, Queens, New York, in the early 1980s. Among the old brick towers of Baisley Park houses, one name began to rise: Kenneth Supreme McGriff. To the kids in the projects, he was a general leading an army. To rivals and police, he was a nightmare, just beginning. McGriff grew up in a working-class family. His parents worked for the city's transit department. They were not destitute, but the lure of the streets was stronger. He formed the Supreme Team, a gang as organized and disciplined as a military unit. They used walkie-talkies to spot police, stationed lookouts on rooftops, and communicated with coded language drawn from the 5% Nation. By the mid-1980s, prosecutors said the crew made more than $200,000 a day from heroin. In a poor housing project that looked like treasure. But money did not buy peace. Queens burned with turf wars. The Supreme Team became known for ruthless enforcement. Even the police avoided Baisley Park after dark. On the streets, McGriff became a symbol of raw power, respected by some, feared by many. In 1989, McGriff was arrested and sentenced to 12 years for drug-related racketeering. Many assumed it was the end, but for Supreme, prison was only halftime. Released in the mid-90s, he returned to Queens stronger than before. He expanded into Maryland and North Carolina, keeping heroin and cocaine flowing into the pipeline. What made him infamous was not just drugs, but his ties to hip-hop. McGriff was connected with Murder, Inc., the label founded by Irv Gotti and featuring Ja Rule. He appeared behind the scenes of music videos, blending crime and culture. For artists, he was both protector and benefactor. For rivals, his nod could mean life or death. The turning point came in 2001. His close friend, Colbert Black Just Johnson, was killed. Supreme vowed revenge. Soon after, underground rapper E Moneybags was shot and killed in Queens. More than 10 rounds fired into his car. Weeks later, Troy Singleton, another figure linked to the feud, was also killed. Later in court, prosecutors said both were murder-for-hire hits ordered by McGriff. Paid in cash and cocaine, cold and calculated. In 2005, federal agents raided Murder Inc.'s offices, launching a massive investigation. By 2007, Kenneth McGriff stood trial again. This time, there would be no second chance. Prosecutors described him as one of the most dangerous and feared traffickers in New York. The jury returned a guilty verdict. The sentence was life without parole. The courtroom fell silent as the judge delivered the words. McGriff barely reacted, as though prison had always been his destiny. Today, Supreme McGriff remains in federal custody, held among America's most dangerous inmates. The Paisley Park empire is gone, but his name still chills those who lived through it. He was more than a drug dealer. He turned a housing project into a fortress, pulled hip-hop into his orbit, and left scars that Queens will never forget. Number 1. Howard Pappy Mason. 3:30 a.m. on February 26, 1988, South Jamaica, Queens, lay in silence. A patrol car sat at the corner of 107th Avenue and Inwood Street. Inside was Officer Edward Byron, just 22 years old, assigned to protect a witness's home. 4 men approached. 2 stood watch, 1 waited behind the wheel. Another stepped to the window. 5 shots rang out. Byrne never made it through his first shift. The order did not come from the street, it came from inside a jail cell, under the name Howard Pappy Mason. Born in 1959, Mason grew up in South Jamaica, the same neighborhood as Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols. When crack swept through New York, Pappy and his crew, known as the Bebos, became a key part of Fat Cat's network. What set Mason apart was his recklessness. He had no hesitation in confronting police, no hesitation in silencing anyone who threatened the flow of money. Even behind bars. He commanded his crew through prison phones and visits. In February 1988, authorities intensified their campaign to dismantle crack operations in Queens. Officer Byrne was posted to guard a witness's home. To Pappy, this was an insult. From his cell, he gave the order. His men were paid $8,000. The mission ended with the killing of a young officer inside his patrol car. A chilling message sent directly to law enforcement. The death of Edward Byrne shocked the nation. President Ronald Reagan called the Byrne family to offer condolences. George H.W. Bush carried Byrne's badge during his presidential campaign. For New Yorkers, it was a stark reality. The gangs were no longer just ruling the streets. They were willing to strike at the state itself. Pappy Mason, once a crack dealer, became the symbol of lawless defiance. But that move also sealed his fate. In 1989, a federal jury concluded Mason had ordered the killing. In 1994, he was sentenced to life without parole. The judge described him as a violent drug dealer who placed no value on human life. Pappy was transferred to maximum security facilities, including time at ADX Florence, the prison reserved for America's most dangerous inmates. Inside, his name remained. The boss who gave orders from behind the wall. But outside, the impact was even greater. Byrne's death led to sweeping policy changes. The Edward Byrne Memorial Justice Assistance Grant was created, today the largest federal funding program for local police. One order, issued from a jail cell, reshaped how America fights crime. Today, the name Pappy Mason is still spoken with a shudder. No one remembers how wealthy he once was. What endures is the memory of a command that cost a young officer his life and rewrote the rules between gangs and government. South Jamaica still stands, but Pappy's shadow is carved into history, a reminder that some decisions once given echo forever.